Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in The Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss 2018 and how it's been a prosperous year for the war industry. Record arms sales posturing over lucrative reconstruction contracts in war-torn countries and the largest ever humanitarian appeal for bombed-out countries. With several economies now more dependent on war for survival, the industry is now targeting schools to better its public image. In such an atmosphere, what chance does true global peace have? To discuss this and a lot more, we're joined here in the studios by Ms. Zunaira Azhar, who is a defense analyst. Zunaira, thanks for taking your time out to join us here. And we're also joined via Skype by Dr. Saba Gul Khattak, who is an independent researcher and is currently the director of Open Society Foundations Pakistan, and she's joining us live from Islamabad. Dr. Saba, thank you for joining us as well. Dr. Saba, I'd like to start with you, if I may, and ask you, what do you make of how war has become essential for many economies worldwide?
Well, for one thing, the global military spending remains at $1.7 trillion. So that in itself tells you the scope. In terms of what sort of the war economy does is it also affects a lot of people. There's massive displacement today. There's 68.5 million people who are displaced, and there's a debate whether this should be looked upon as a humanitarian crisis or a development crisis, because depending on how we define this, different organizations come into it. So for instance, the UN, which is got the humanitarian agenda, will work on these kinds of crises, but the World Bank is now vying to provide loans and do much more funding, and it is trying to establish this as a development issue because that is what the World Bank's primary agenda is. Most of the countries are low-income or middle-income countries that are war-torn or conflict-torn. I think we need to distinguish between the two. It's important. But I'll stop here and let you go ahead with what you want to talk about.
We'll continue the conversation, of course. Zunaira, I wanted to get your thoughts as well, because war literally is making a lot of countries and a lot of people very, very rich, isn't it?
Well, I'm so glad you've taken up this subject because it's vastly ignored and a lot of people don't know about it. But since I've seen it very closely, I was studying in one of a defense academy where I saw how much defense spending was going on the research, on the arms supply, on the experimentation, how much students are taking up the scholarships from the government, what they call it a revolving door. And the concept of that revolving door is that you join the government, you become a lobbyist, or you are hired by a lobby. We call it super PACs in US. And then again, you join the government, that is Congress. The lobbyist become the intermediary person between the private contractors, the arms suppliers, and the governments. The silly thing is that in 2012, when I was observing the American elections, nobody in the American public knew what is super PAC, what is a lobby, who is a lobbyist, what do they do. And since 1931, Texas Oil Company, which in 1960 became Halliburton, CEO was Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense. They have been into this business. So this is that old. Margaret Thatcher's son, Mark Thatcher, he earned almost 12 trillion pounds out of a deal with Saudi Arabia. So since 1985, UK is supplying largest in the Western Europe, supplying arms to Saudi Arabia. Similarly, US is the largest arms supplier to Saudi Arabia. And where are these safe havens for these lobbyists and these companies? It's in Dubai. So, you know, there is a whole nexus. And I don't understand why something so big is so organized is how come it is hidden from the rest of the world and nobody is talking about it. Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense, when George H.W. Bush was in presidency, he was trying to oppose the Iraq war at its best. Later on, after that presidency, he became the CEO of the same company, Halliburton. And when he joined the Bush Jr., he propagated that we need to invade Iraq.
Yeah.
And while there were discussions in UN whether it is a viable option or not, the largest oil supplier companies were already in Iraq. So things were pre-planned since, you know.
And that's a very good point that you made, Zarina, because this issue of revolving doors is an important one, and I want to talk about that actually. And I'm going to add another voice to this conversation. We now have Mr. Imtiaz Gul, who is an analyst, and he's joining us live from Islamabad. He's also the executive director of the Center for Research and Security Studies. Mr. Gul, thanks for joining us here in the scope. I wanted to get your thoughts, Mr. Gul, on this revolving door that exists between what I would call the war industry, be it arms companies or otherwise, and politics, really. And we can look at the example of the US, the UK, or many of these other very large economies which seemingly now are being more and more based on war.
Well, I would say that it's not just about the arms industry, which operates through the revolving doors. If you look at all big economies, if you look at the how business works, the contracting work, for instance, so it all, I think, rests on revolving doors in the corridors of power, whether it's in the United States, in China, in the UK, or in Pakistan. Primarily, it's just another branch of business. And obviously, there are people, vendors, agents working for it. And this is how, we have seen this destruction of Iraq and this invasion of Afghanistan, how it basically created this space for more and more weapons in the Middle East itself. So just, you just create one monster, through one invasion, and then all people around that feel insecure and then scramble for more weapons. So this is basically military interventions in different parts of the world have created this huge space for the arms industry as well as for the contracting industries. I'm sure you know, a lot of people would know how this civilian contracting industry serves the U.S. military itself. So I think this is something that has become inevitable part of life, part of the economies. Look at how Russia has sold, latest defense systems to India, worth several billions of dollars, despite an overwhelming incidence of poverty in India. I mean, there are 350 million people living below the poverty line, but this country is going for all latest defense systems, including submarines. So I think this is something that we at the civil society level, at the media level, can only observe, lament, criticize, but can't really help stop.
And that's a very good point, Mr. Gul, that you made. And Dr. Sabah, I wanted to bring that up. What can be done? What should be done to stop this trend? Because it's a dangerous one, isn't it? Where ever more countries are spending that much more on their defense budgets, buying ever more arms that are even more lethal. Instead of, as Mr. Gul there cited the example, of course, of India, but I'm sure we can cite many other such examples where their own citizens, though, are going hungry.
So what can be done? I think we have heard that for more than a century now. The efforts, whether at world organizations, the League of Nations, the United Nations, so on and so forth, and yet there is a certain degree of very pungent kind of nationalism that has come around, reared its ugly head again all over the world. Mostly, you see it starkly in Europe, which is amazing. The right wing, the rise of the right wing, and in the United States, in India, in some of the world's largest democracies. So what can be done is really a question that we can debate forever and ever, but the change has to come politically. Unfortunately, the kind of politics that is rising is that of the right wing. So honestly speaking, I think there are, pushbacks against this, and we need to sort of invest more in the pushback against such kinds of nationalism, such kinds of warmongering. But China has made the highest increases in its own military expenditures. So has the United States in absolute terms. So those kinds of checks have to come from the international community. They cannot be at the individual level. They cannot be brought about by one country. They need to be brought about holistically.
Okay, so Zonera, one thing which alarmed me as I was doing research for this show, and you may have come across this report too, is that the UK arms industry, and I'm just using this as an example, is now going into schools and is sponsoring classes where they're encouraging students to, for example, sit in makeshift missiles and play with them as toys and make it acceptable, basically, to the work they do. Their argument is that, listen, we need future engineers in our country and that the UK has a shortage of engineers, so we're going to encourage students to become engineers of the future. But that's dangerous, isn't it, to let the arms industry or the war industry, as we can call it broader terms, into the classroom, where you're face to face with innocent children.
I'm surprised that you've come across this narrative, because when I was there were right-wing people who said that we need to follow US because this Islamophobe and all that is coming to UK very fast, and we need to prepare our nation for that. And they want to introduce the gun culture to their children as well, because they think that you should be able to defend yourself. In schools, the racism and bullying to the people of color, it's on rise, and this gun culture, I think that is more relevant as compared to what you are saying, that they want to make engineers, create engineers. Like, all right, if you want to do that, you don't have to do that at elementary level. You know what I mean? But what's alarming is that the Defense Academy, where I was studying, 80% of the budget was allocated to the forensics, to the IEDs, to the missile systems, to the softwares which could be attached to drones and all that. And only 20% was allocated to social sciences. And like, people used to look down upon the social scientists because they said, oh, this has no future. So you can see where their education is going even. But I would like to bring your attention towards this thing that there was a time when there were no standing army in the world. There were mercenaries. You could just buy them. You could give them food and they would fight for you. Now there are mercenaries coming back, and they are coming under the banner of private contractors, right? So the same similar things are now being repeated. The contractors which joined US in Iraq are joining NATO in another country now. It is happening in Yemen. It is happening in Syria. They are revolving around the world. So it's a very tiny but a very wealthy world, and they are controlling the Congress, they are controlling the House of Westminster, they are controlling everything. Whatever bill is passed through the congressional debates, it is already pre-decided because there is a lobby behind it. So I don't understand if there is an end to it, or if you could cap it with anything to help towards the global security or the peace and conflict resolution, because nobody is interested in that. And to make it my point more viable, I was shocked to see my fellow students who were from Israel, who told me that every 2 years, when we attack repeatedly in Gaza Strip, the very next year we have an exhibition where whatever is installed is bannered as it has been used on humans and it is effective. So like you are actually experimenting on human lives. So, and then there is a trail wherever there is a war, then you need food. So there will be food industry coming in, there will be pharmaceutical industry coming in. So this is how this industry is flourishing, and who would want to stop it?
Exactly, and that's the point I wanted to bring to you, Mr. Gul, as well. We are, at the end of the day, talking, Mr. Gul, about human beings, aren't we? And I know this is a very macro question to ask, it's very open-ended, but I wanted to get your thoughts about the effect that not only war has, but then as Zonera there mentioned, these other industries coming in, be it even the reconstruction industry, and we can talk about Syria, for example, where there's now talk about who will reconstruct Syria after this devastating crisis and war there. How does this affect, human beings, and why isn't that, brought into the calculation when we're talking about be it the arms industry, the reconstruction industry, or even the aid industry?
Well, I think the reconstruction by the United States or by leading European countries takes place only in those places which remain geopolitically relevant to those countries. In the case of Yemen, I think the Western countries, including the United States, probably feel that the Russians have outpaced them, and somehow Syria has turned into a bastion of power, stronghold for the Russians, and that's why I think the American president decided to disengage from there. So that basically would mean a long haul for the people, for tens of thousands of people who have suffered all these years. And this is the fate of many people in other countries. I mean, look at Iraq, the way people suffered there. Some U.S. troops are still there, but most of them were taken out just after, I think, striking deals with the oil companies, the long-term oil export deals to the United States. So as a result, the human beings keep suffering, whether they are in Iraq, in Syria, in Pakistan, or in Afghanistan. And I think we seem to be caught in an extremely vicious cycle. To give you the example of Afghanistan, where the annual expenditure on maintaining those 14,000 American troops has been like around $45 billion. And then there came a proposal by Eric Prince of Blackwater that, why not, if this could be outsourced to Blackwater, the company could do it for $10 billion. And this, I think, appears very attractive for President Trump, who is a typical businessman, and I think who would like to show to his people that by outsourcing the security of Afghanistan to a private company, he has ended up saving $30+ billion for the American nation. So this is, I think, something that we really are helpless, totally helpless, and I think this will keep on going. It's a challenge how to disincentivize investments in defense, how to discourage spendings on acquisition of security systems, and can we really solve conflicts which have geopolitical trappings, countries which are basically allied with one nation or the other, and then they're caught in the conflicting narratives, and the consequence invariably is the continuation of conflict.
Okay, so Dr. Sabah, one question that may come up is that, listen, a lot of those economies that are now war dependent are capitalist societies. So the money rules there 99% of the time. So why do you think it is, Dr. Sabah, that the peace industry, if I may term it that, you may choose to term it another way, why isn't the peace industry being able to convince governments or businessmen that, listen, we're actually good for your bottom line as well? Or is that just a very hard sell?
Well, it is a hard sell, especially if the influx of weapons continues and those at the top continue to need those weapons to keep themselves in power. That's one. The other is that, the reconstruction industry or the aid industry has several facets or aspects. There's bilateral aid, there is military aid, there is multilateral aid, there's humanitarian aid. So which type and the kind of wastage that takes place for every dollar that is spent, how much actually seeps down to the person who is most affected. We all know that there's a lot of wastage and not just in overheads. So really, and the deep problems of poverty that ensue from conflicts and wars cannot possibly be addressed through reconstruction or the aid industry. I mean, they're part of the answer, but not really the entire answer. You destroy a whole economy, you destroy an entire generation of educated people, of professional people who leave the country. So the best people go abroad to other places that are more secure. So, it is such a deep crisis that to answer it with only reconstruction is just not the answer.
Very well. We'll have to leave the final word. Time has gotten the best of us. But of course, we appreciate all of our esteemed guests and the insight that they provided. We had Dr. Sabah Gul Khadak there speaking live via Skype from Islamabad. She's an independent researcher and the director of the Open Society Foundations here in Pakistan. We were also joined here in the studios by Ms. Zanira Azhar, who is a defense analyst. We appreciate you coming in, Zanira.
Thanks.
And we were joined by Mr. Imtiaz Gul, analyst from Islamabad, who is also joining us live. And he is executive director of the Center for Research and Security Studies. And now, viewers, as all of our guests there spoke about, it seems that we've only really touched the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the war industry. There are so many facets that can be discussed. Reconstruction, as I mentioned, aid, as well as Dr. Sabah there mentioned at the end in her final answer, and of course the arms sales themselves. The fact that, of course, these are capitalist societies we're talking about, which, where money rules, and politicians and the arms industry and these other industries that I spoke about, there's this revolving door that exists between them. This poses, of course, a challenge to resolving this issue, but one that really needs to be resolved before it gets completely out of hands, which it may already have. We'll leave it there for now, but thank you for watching. I've been Waqar Rizvi, and this has been Scope.